All right, so there you have it, a short adjournment as expected at a minute before 11 o'clock. Once again, we're coming to you live from the Bridgette Mabandla Justice College, where a third witness at the Madlanga Commission of Inquiry has wrapped up her first leg, if you like, of her testimony. Major General Bridgette Van Rooyen. Excuse me, she is the head of governance, legislation and policy with the Legal Services Division of the SABC. And as we had anticipated, she is here to help us get a better understanding of the legislative framework that governs the work of the SABC. This in some ways is where the rubber hits the road in trying to ascertain whether, frankly, the suspended minister went too far when he gave that directive for the Political Killings Task Team to be disbanded. Kenny Mapanga is also here with us. We'll touch base with her in just a moment, but I want to take you back to what we thought was a really important moment of the Major General's testimony when she was asked to clarify whether that note that was given on the 31st of December can frankly be seen as a directive or an instruction, and what she makes of it. Listen to that response in the witness's own words.
The question is, was it a lawful instruction or direction, in the sense that the minister have the power to direct or command the closure of a task team that was investigating crimes? And in my view, he did not have that authority, because it relates to the operations, investigating cases, and the operations of the police. In other words, the execution of the police's mandate in terms of Section 205(3). If we say the National Commissioner is responsible to manage and control the police service, that must be linked to manage and control the police service in the execution of its constitutional mandate. And the decision of a minister to close a political task team that was responsible for the investigation of crime, in my view, fell outside the mandate or authority of the minister.
All right, so there you have it. Once again, let's bring in Kenny Mapanga, who was inside the auditorium as those words were being uttered. Essentially, this expert witness, Kenny, saying that decision ultimately had an impact on the operations of the SABC, and as far as she's concerned, that's unlawful.
Indeed. I remember this morning we said that the SABC Act must be read together with the Constitution, particularly that is Chapter 11 that deals with security services. If we go to Section 207, which deals with the control of the police service, you'll see that Section 207, subsection 1, says that the President, as the head of the National Executive, must appoint a woman or a man as the National Commissioner of the Police Service to control and manage the police service. But subsection 2 goes on to say that the National Commissioner must exercise that control over and manage the police service in accordance with the national policing policy and the directions of the cabinet member responsible for policing. So what you've seen is the Commission exploring the argument by the SABC officials that it was unlawful against the backdrop that there may be a defense that he was issuing a directive as a cabinet member in terms of the national policing policy. But she says that that directive would demand, because it has implications on the operations of the South African police services, which she argues that the National Police Commissioner is responsible for. That, of course, makes that decision unlawful. In terms of policy, she states that a policy cannot be made in terms of the decisions of a president or a minister, but that a policy is something that is created in that financial year for the police to follow overall. So it's not a decision that you can unilaterally make. And then she raises the questions of rationality that we discussed earlier, that should that power exist, which she argues it doesn't in terms of this demand that was issued against Section 207, subsection 2 of the Constitution. But if it exists, she then goes on to state that the decision must still be rational. So it must follow a rational process in order for it to be deemed valid and therefore constitutional in terms of the law.
Sure, yeah, and we can see the Commission also being very cautious about how they go about approaching all of this, right? And I suppose that's because ultimately what they decide here hopefully should be so watertight that we don't find ourselves in a similar situation as we discussed earlier on.
Yes.
Because there were concessions that, even in the past and in other scenarios, it'd be difficult to call whether something is purely just policy or
purely a directive.
Exactly.
But then in that instance as well, the Commission goes on to acknowledge that an immediate directive can also be made by the minister. There are circumstances upon which he can draw that power to say that this is a directive I'm issuing and it must be given effect to immediately. But Maj-Gen Van Rooyen is saying that in this instance, where you're dealing with a task team and the decision directly implicates the ability for that task team to operate, or rather police operations at large, that didn't fall within the ambit of the minister, but rather in the ambit of the National Commissioner, making that decision unlawful.
Yes.
So this is someone who has over 40 years of experience in the police service, and of course we've seen her credentials going up to an LLD, and then I think it's the Masters in Constitutional Law and an LLD in Criminal Law. So this is someone who's interpreting the legislation and probably has to quite a number of times working within the South African Police Services, giving the view that upon interpretation of this legislation, the directive would have been unlawful. Of course, this makes this even more difficult for Police Minister Senzo Mchunu, because now that defense that could have emerged, we expect could have emerged when he comes during phase 2, which we expect he will probably be here, is now in the air, because still that power does not exist, according to this expert testimony, to issue a directive of that nature that directly implicates the operations of the South African Police Services.
Yeah, I found one of the questions from one of the commissioners quite interesting, who essentially asked Maj-Gen Van Rooyen whether a minister can rearrange the priorities of the SAPS, right? Which is not the same as, a complete disbandment of a specialized unit, but I suppose could have an impact on operations. And the expert witness struggled to kind of respond to that, and, essentially came down to it being situational, and made an example that if there were to be a major explosion, for example, in a city, sure. But in other situations, it's a bit murky.
Yeah, but she does go through the 4 priorities that are currently stated right now, that there is room for those priorities to be created by the minister. But again, you're speaking about an overall accountability, responsibility, and ability to, give a strategic direction to the South African Police Services. But with the PKTT, we're dealing with a very specific, direct demand, allegedly coming from the Minister of Police, and it is giving the Commissioner little to no room to give effect to it, because it's saying you must do it immediately. And of course, this is a team that's already functioning and thriving within the police operations. So I think the legislative framework gets to the crux of the issue in terms of their 2 roles, but the ambiguity is created when one looks at it as a directive, that is a policy directive, versus whether the power was there in the first place. So I think what she is stating is that the emphasis should be on whether this instruction was lawful or not, not whether, he could give the instruction or not, because we know the cabinet member has certain responsibilities, and we know they have the policy making powers within the South African Police Services. But with this specific instance of the PKTT, she's saying the emphasis must be on this, whether this directive or instruction was lawful.
Right. And part of answering that question is ascertaining what the impact of that instruction was, right? And in this case, she says, well, ultimately it had an impact on operations, and that's how she arrives to her own conclusion.
Yes, and both SAP's witnesses, that is Lieutenant General Nhlanhla Mkhwanazi and General Fannie Masemola, have stated that the team was doing incredible work, succeeding in all of its areas where it was mandated to work, and that it had pending cases that it still needed to wind up, which is why General Fannie Masemola recommended the phased winding down approach. But again, he has testified that there was an eagerness to see it end completely, immediately, within a short frame time, and they attribute this to this alleged organized crime syndicate that had been nabbed by this particular team when it went in to assist those GCI ops in the Gauteng province. But certainly several more questions have been created for the police minister, because this is not only an expert witness that is assisting with the understanding of the legal framework, but she is coming in as someone that has operated within the South African Police Services and advised the South African Police Services on a number of legal implications relating to its operations. And she's also created that clear distinction between the two roles, seeking clarity on how far that role can go. So even where there's instances where one could argue that the power was there, she also affirms the testimony that there's limitations to the question of when and how.
Absolutely.
So there's a lot for the minister to answer, what the rationale behind the directive was, why it was so rushed, and why it was taken without consulting, at the very least, the National Commissioner, who the Constitution empowers to have control over the operations of the South African Police Services. So certainly more witnesses that are creating more questions. They may be closing the gaps in Lieutenant General Mkwanazi's testimony, evidence in chief that we saw last week. But for a number of those high-ranking SABC officials and the minister, there'll certainly be questions regarding where did you even draw the power to take the actions that you were taking. And for Lieutenant General Shadrack Sibiya, as someone who reported to the National Commission of SABC, where he drew the understanding that he could give effect to the minister's directive without the approval of the National Commissioner.
Exactly. And in fact, that question was posed before this tea break by the chairperson, if it's not one of the commissioners, who said, you know, is there a scenario where a deputy commissioner could take instructions directly from the minister and didn't necessarily go into whether or not that's lawful? And the expert witness was very clear in her response.
No. It would have to come from the National Commissioner,
exactly,
as the Constitution empowers him to exercise control over that police service. And of course, he has the power to appoint. And then when you go into the provinces, as long as the instructions given by the provincial commissioners don't contradict what the National Commissioner has set out for the policing operations, then that decision would be found to be lawful. So certainly from the legislative framework, there's a lot of questions, at least for Lieutenant General Shadrack Sibiya and the Minister of Police, Senzo Mchunu, as to why this directive was made and why it was imposed with an immediate demand attached to it for the National Commissioner of SABC. And of course then almost vindicating Lieutenant General Mkwanazi's understanding of the legislative framework, that the instruction could not come from the minister but only the National Commissioner of Police. And then again affirming the National Commissioner of Police assertion that even if it were to be taken, a directive like that would be taken in terms of policy, that the how and the when fell under his responsibility, not that of the minister.
All right, Kenny Mapanga helping us, I suppose, distill some of what can be very complex testimony here at the Madlanga Commission of Inquiry, sitting for a 6th day. We're hearing now from a third witness in Major General Petronella Maj-Gen Van Rooyen. She's once again the head of governance, legislation and policy within the legal services division of the SAPS, helping us, I suppose, get a better understanding of the steps at the very least that should be taken if there's going to be any kind of instruction coming from the minister to the National Police Commissioner, if that instruction is going to be lawful. We're keeping a very close eye on developments as they continue to unfold here at the Bridgette Mabandla Justice College.